Hey there, and welcome back to Drowsy History. Tonight, we're going somewhere a little different from usual. Not to a battlefield, not to a royal court filled with candlelight and intrigue, not to the deck of a sailing ship cutting through cold green water toward some unknown coast. Tonight, we're going somewhere quieter than all of that, and in some ways, far more unsettling. We're going behind locked doors, behind the high stone walls and long, echoing corridors of the Victorian asylum, where thousands of ordinary women spent their days and their nights, sometimes for a few months, sometimes for years on end, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, for the rest of their lives. But I want to be clear about something right from the beginning. This is not a story about darkness for its own sake. This is not a ghost story, or a horror story, or a tale designed to disturb you before you sleep. This is a story about women. Specific, complicated, determined, often remarkable women. The ones who were confined inside those walls and who refused to be entirely silenced by the experience. The ones who worked inside those institutions, scrubbing floors and changing linens and sitting up through the long nights, and who brought more skill and more compassion to that work than anyone bothered to officially recognize. The ones who stood outside the walls and hammered on them, legally and publicly and persistently, until something finally began to give. This is a story about power and medicine, about what happens when an entire society decides that certain kinds of women, too emotional, too inconvenient, too unwilling to perform contentment on cue, are not just difficult, are not just unhappy, are not just reacting in understandable ways to impossible circumstances, are sick, and about what some of those women did about it. So settle in wherever you are right now. Pull the covers a little closer if you like. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. Let the day begin to recede. Before we begin, if these slow histories have been helping you sleep, and if you'd like to help this channel keep growing, please consider subscribing. It truly makes a difference. And whenever you like, tonight, tomorrow morning, whenever the mood takes you, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every single one, usually with something warm in my hand, and it always means something to know how far these stories travel in the dark. You're also very welcome to suggest a topic you'd love to hear covered. Some of the best videos on this channel have come from exactly that. There is no quiz at the end of this one. There is no pressure to remember every name, every date, every detail. You don't even need to stay awake, though I hope some of this is interesting enough to keep you with me for a while. Just let the words move through you, slow and steady, like lamplight in a long corridor, like the sound of a key turning in an old lock. Take a breath and let's step back together into a world that no longer exists in quite the same form, but whose echoes are still very much with us. To understand what happened inside the Victorian asylum, you first have to understand the world that built it and believed in it and kept filling it up with women. Victorian Britain was a society of extraordinarily rigid, carefully maintained order, not just in the obvious ways, the class distinctions, the starched collars, the elaborate social rituals, but in the deeper, more fundamental way that every person was understood to have a place, a role, a set of behaviors that were appropriate to their station. And women, perhaps more than any other group, were hemmed in by an almost architectural system of expectations about who they were supposed to be and how they were supposed to move through the world. A respectable Victorian woman, and respectability was everything. The organizing principle of middle class life was supposed to be calm, composed, deferential to her husband, warm toward her children, gracious to her social circle. She was supposed to manage the home with quiet efficiency. She was supposed to perform contentment with the life she had been given, regardless of what that life actually looked like from the inside. And she was supposed to do all of this without complaint, without the kind of loud, visible, inconvenient distress that would draw attention to the gap between the public ideal and the private reality. When women failed to meet these expectations, and many did, for reasons that range from the entirely understandable to the entirely inevitable, Victorian society had developed an elegant and terrifying solution. It called the failure illness, it gave it a medical name, and it sent the woman away. The concept of mental illness in the Victorian era was still very young, still deeply confused, and completely saturated with assumptions about gender, class, and the perceived fragility of the female body and mind. The medical establishment of the period, and it is worth remembering that this establishment was composed almost entirely of men, genuinely, sincerely believed that women were constitutionally more vulnerable to mental breakdown than men. The female nervous system, they wrote with great confidence in their textbooks and journals, was more delicate. The female brain was more susceptible to the disruptions caused by strong emotion, by intellectual strain, by the turbulence of the reproductive cycle, by the sheer physiological burden of being a woman. This was not fringe opinion. This was taught in medical schools. It appeared in the most respected journals of the day. It was cited by the lunacy commissioners, the government body officially responsible for overseeing the asylum system, in their annual reports to Parliament. The great physicians of the age, men whose names still appeared in the history of psychiatry, wrote at extraordinary length about the particular vulnerabilities of the female constitution. They theorized about the ways in which menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and menopause each created specific windows of mental fragility. They argued that education beyond a certain level was actively dangerous for women, that the strain of intellectual work on the female nervous system risked permanent damage. They were wrong about almost all of it, but they were wrong with tremendous institutional authority, and the legal and social structures of the period were built around their conclusions. The practical consequences moved very quickly from theory into daily life. A woman who wept too much could be committed. A woman who refused to eat. A woman who expressed anger toward her husband in a way he found excessive or alarming. A woman who had borne an illegitimate child. A woman who drank. A woman who had tried to leave a violent marriage. A woman who held strong religious opinions and expressed them too loudly. A woman who talked back to doctors. A woman who was simply, flatly inconvenient to the people around her. And crucially, these were not rare exceptions at the edges of the system. The admission registers of the great Victorian county asylums, where they survive in archives across England, tell the story in the blunt shorthand of institutional record keeping. Reason for admission: intemperance, domestic trouble, grief, religious excitement, disappointment in love, overwork, moral insanity, domestic difficulty, puerperal excitement. These phrases, entered by a clerk in a ledger, represent a woman's life compressed into a single line. The legal framework that made all of this possible was not difficult to navigate, at least not if you were the person doing the committing rather than the person being committed. In England and Wales, the Lunacy Act of 1845 established the formal architecture of the county asylum system and required that patients be certified by a medical officer before admission. In theory, this requirement was a protection, proof that the system was medically rigorous rather than arbitrary. In practice, the certification process was often startlingly casual. A husband could bring his wife to an asylum with the signatures of a single general practitioner, a man who might be a personal acquaintance, who might have spent 30 minutes with the woman in question, who had no independent means of verifying anything she said or didn't say, and who had every professional and social incentive to defer to the husband's account of the situation. The woman herself had almost no legal recourse at the moment of admission. She could not simply refuse. She could not demand a second opinion. She could not appeal to a magistrate in time to stop the process. She could protest, and many did, loudly and coherently, but protest was easily reframed as agitation, as evidence of the very instability that was being cited as the reason for her admission. The system was, from the very beginning, self sealing in the most fundamental way, and once inside the walls, the requirements for release were equally weighted against the patient. Discharge required the agreement of the medical superintendent, often the formal approval of the institution's governing committee, and almost always the willingness of a family member or an officially recognized sponsor to come forward, take formal responsibility, and receive the woman back into the world. If the family that had committed her had no interest in receiving her back, if the husband had moved on, if the brother had already arranged the finances to his satisfaction, if there was simply no one whose circumstances had changed enough to want her, she stayed. The institution filled up with these women over the decades. The chronic, long stay population grew and grew. By the 1870s, the great county asylums of England were extraordinary institutions in terms of their sheer scale. Colney Hatch in North London, opened in 1851, had been designed with what its architects considered great foresight to accommodate 1,000 patients. Within 20 years, it held nearly 2,000. Hanwell in West London had grown similarly. Claybury in Essex, Wakefield in Yorkshire, Rainhill in Lancashire, all of them swelling year after year with patients who arrived and rarely left. The institutions had become cities unto themselves, complete with their own farms, bakeries, laundries, gardens, chapels, and cemeteries. They had their own water supplies, their own gas works, their own small economies. Thousands of people lived and worked inside them. It was the largest and most sustained experiment in institutional social control that Britain had ever undertaken, and women, as patients, as nurses, as domestic workers, as matrons, and sometimes as reformers pressing against the outside of the walls, were at the center of it. If you open the admission register, of almost any Victorian county asylum and begin to read the column headed Cause of Insanity or Reason for Admission, you will encounter a taxonomy of human experience that is by turns medically precise, bewilderingly vague, and deeply revealing about what Victorian society expected women to be and what it did when they refused. Puerperal insanity was one of the most common diagnoses given to women admitted to asylums across the Victorian period, and it deserves careful attention because it contains within it such a range of very different actual experiences. Some of the women admitted under this heading were experiencing what we would now recognize as severe postpartum psychosis, a genuine, serious, biologically rooted illness that required real medical intervention. Their experience inside the asylum, however imperfect the care, was at least an improvement over being left alone and unsupported in a home where no one knew what to do with them. But the category stretched far beyond this. Women who were exhausted after difficult births and the demands of nursing newborns in conditions of poverty and domestic stress were admitted under the same heading. Women who were grieving babies who had died were admitted. Women whose depression after childbirth was the entirely understandable response to circumstances: a violent husband, a house with no heat, 5 children already, and no prospect of relief, that would have depressed almost anyone were admitted. The asylum was the single institutional response available, and it was applied to all of them alike, without the distinctions that even the medicine of the period was theoretically capable of drawing. Hysteria was another vast and infinitely flexible category. Its roots stretched back to ancient Greece, and the belief that the uterus was a wandering organ capable of traveling through the body and causing disruption wherever it settled. The word hysteria itself derives from the Greek word for uterus. By the Victorian period, the wandering uterus theory had long been abandoned, but hysteria as a diagnostic category had expanded to fill the space left by its original rationale until it could mean almost anything at all: fainting, crying, trembling, paralysis of a limb, inability to speak, laughing at inappropriate moments, expressing distress that the doctors around her considered disproportionate to its apparent cause, expressing any strong opinion with too much conviction, refusing to eat or to leave the bed. Any and all of these could be labeled hysteria, and the diagnosis, once applied, had the effect of delegitimizing everything the woman said about her own experience, because the woman's own account of her experience was itself understood to be a symptom. The French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot turned hysteria into something close to a theatrical spectacle at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, where he conducted public demonstrations of hysterical women, many of them working-class patients with no power to refuse their role in the performance, for audiences of medical students, journalists, artists, and curious members of the public. He would demonstrate their symptoms under hypnosis. He would induce and then relieve their episodes of apparent paralysis or convulsion. The young Sigmund Freud spent time at the Salpêtrière and was deeply influenced by what he saw there. The British medical establishment watched Charcot's demonstrations with a mixture of fascination and skepticism, but the basic framework of hysteria as a distinctively female affliction rooted in the nervous system's response to reproductive physiology was too useful and too convenient to discard. Nymphomania was a diagnosis that was applied with a breadth that reads now as barely credible. It was used to commit women who had had affairs outside their marriages, women who had been sexually assaulted and were considered to have brought attention to the matter in ways that were embarrassing, women who expressed any form of sexual desire in contexts where such desire was not considered appropriate, women who masturbated and whose behavior had been observed or reported. The diagnosis required no particular evidence of extreme behavior, only evidence of a disposition toward sexuality that existed outside the precise boundaries of sanctioned married life, boundaries that were drawn, inevitably, by the men with the authority to draw them. That male sexuality of equivalent or far greater intensity was almost never pathologized in any equivalent way was noted by some reform minded observers of the period. It had essentially no effect on medical practice. Moral insanity was perhaps the most philosophically interesting and most dangerous of all the Victorian diagnostic categories. The concept, developed in the early 19th century by the English physician James Cowles Pritchard, described a condition in which the patient's moral faculties were disturbed while their intellectual faculties remained intact. A person who knew, in an intellectual sense, what the rules were, but who persistently refused to follow them. The diagnosis could be applied to anyone whose behavior was consistently outside the social norm, without any of the more obvious markers of mental disturbance. No hallucinations, no delusions, no apparent confusion about reality. Simply persistent, principled refusal to conform. You can see immediately how useful this diagnosis was as an institutional tool and how easily it could be applied to women who were doing nothing more or less than refusing clearly and coherently to accept the terms of their lives. And then there were the admissions that even the period's own terminology struggled to medicalize. Women committed because their brothers wanted their property. Women committed because their husbands wanted to remarry and the existing wife was an obstacle. Women committed because their families were ashamed of some aspect of their behavior or their history and preferred that they simply not be visible. The asylum, in these cases, was functioning not as a medical institution, but as something far older and less defensible, a warehouse, a mechanism for removing inconvenient people from a world that found them troublesome. The women who found themselves inside the asylum through any of these routes, the genuinely ill, the circumstantially distressed, the wrongfully confined, and every permutation in between, occupied wards that were shaped entirely by the institutional logic of the place. The most acutely disturbed patients were on the locked wards under close supervision with minimal stimulation and in the earlier Victorian period, significant physical restraint. Women deemed calmer and more tractable were on the open wards, where they could move more freely within the building and participate in the work that the asylum ran on. The graduation from locked ward to open ward, from open ward to greater responsibility, from greater responsibility toward the distant prospect of discharge, was the formal structure of institutional life, the pathway toward freedom, such as it was. One of the things that the Victorian asylum could not entirely accomplish, despite its best institutional efforts, was silence. The system was designed to contain, to regulate, to classify, and ultimately to manage the women inside it. What it was not fully equipped to do was prevent some of those women from watching, thinking, remembering, and eventually writing. The body of testimony that emerged from women who had been confined in Victorian asylums, some of it published in their lifetimes, some preserved in private letters and diaries, some only fully recovered by historians working through archives a century later, is one of the most remarkable and most undervalued documents in the history of women's experience. These accounts vary enormously in tone and style and ambition. Some are precise legal arguments, some are fiercely emotional, some are almost unbearably restrained, written by women who understood perfectly that any sign of passion in their prose would be used to discredit them. Louisa Lowe is perhaps the most significant single figure in this tradition, and she deserves more than a paragraph because her life after her release from the asylum was an extraordinary act of sustained, disciplined rage, channeled into reform. Lowe was a middle class Englishwoman with strong, somewhat unconventional religious convictions and a marriage that had been deteriorating for years by the time her husband invoked the Lunacy Acts against her in 1870. She was taken to a private asylum, certified by doctors her husband had arranged, and confined without any meaningful opportunity to contest the process. She was 49 years old. She was not, by any measure, she could apply to herself or that the historical record sustains, mentally ill. She was someone whose husband found her inconvenient and had the legal means to act on that inconvenience. She was held for 18 months. When she was finally released, she did not go home and be quiet. She began writing almost immediately, and she wrote with a precision and a structural rigor that reflected her clear understanding of the central challenge she faced. Any account she gave of her experience would be filtered through the lens of her recent certification. Every emotional word she wrote would be cited as evidence of her instability. Every expression of outrage would confirm, in the minds of those who preferred not to believe her, that she was exactly as disturbed as the certification had claimed. So she stripped her prose of feeling and filled it instead with facts, dates, names, case numbers, the specific language of the legal orders that had governed her admission and detention, the precise wording of the certificates signed by the doctors. She founded the Lunacy Law Reform Society and ran it for years. She held public meetings. She wrote to newspapers. She corresponded at length with members of Parliament and with the Lunacy Commission itself. She gathered testimony from other former patients, and there were many, some willing to attach their names to their accounts, and many more who were not, because the stigma of having been confined was severe enough that many women preferred silence over the exposure that advocacy required. Lowe compiled their stories anyway, anonymized where necessary, and wove them into the pamphlets and reports that the Society published. She was not always believed. The medical establishment had obvious institutional reasons to discredit her, and they did so with the particular efficiency that comes from professional solidarity. But she was persistent on a scale that eventually became impossible to entirely ignore. She kept writing. She kept appearing. She kept asking questions that required answers. Rosina Bulwer-Lytton's case operated at a very different social register, but illuminated the same fundamental problem with a vividness that the press found irresistible. Rosina was the wife of Edward Bulwer-Lytton, novelist, politician, literary lion of the mid-Victorian period, and, by all accounts, including Rosina's extensive and detailed ones, a deeply difficult man whose treatment of his wife and children had been a source of private scandal for years. The marriage had long since collapsed, and Rosina had spent the intervening years using her considerable intelligence and wit to make her husband's life as uncomfortable as possible, which she did primarily by telling anyone who would listen exactly what she thought of him. In the summer of 1858, during a parliamentary election in which her husband was standing, Rosina appeared at a public meeting in Hartford and confronted him directly before the assembled voters. She spoke. She was eloquent. The newspapers covered it with glee. Edward Bulwer Lytton, within weeks, arranged for her to be certified and taken to White House, a private asylum in Brentford. The certification was completed with the signatures of two physicians, both arranged through his connections, after examinations of breathtaking brevity. The public response was immediate and significant. Rosina had supporters, and they were not quiet. Letters appeared in newspapers. The alleged Lunatics' Friend Society, the oldest advocacy organization concerned with wrongful confinement, took a direct interest. Questions were raised in exactly the political circles that her husband most needed to be comfortable in. She was released after 3 weeks, far too quickly for the medical justification for her admission to be at all credible, and the incident shadowed Bulwer Lytton for the rest of his career. It also fed directly into the growing public and parliamentary debate about the ease with which the lunacy acts could be weaponized. Most women who passed through the asylum doors did so without the social connections and the public platform that gave Rosina Bulwer Lytton's case its visibility. Most of them left no published account, but the records they did leave, letters that survived in family papers, diary entries, testimony given to the Lunacy Commission's inspectors during their official visits, case notes that recorded a patient's own words, even as they reframed those words through a diagnostic lens, build collectively into a picture of astonishing vividness. They described the physical environment with careful precision. The cold that settled into the dormitories in winter and never fully left, the smell of the wards, carbolic soap and cooked vegetables, and something underneath that was harder to name, the particular quality of silence that existed inside an institution where hundreds of people lived in close proximity and yet were systematically discouraged from speaking freely to one another. They described the passage of time as one of the most disorienting features of institutional life. Days that were structured identically, week after week and month after month, so that the calendar lost its meaning and seasons became the only reliable marker of time's passage. They described the experience of being assessed by doctors who had decided what they were going to find before they entered the room. The way that every calm, coherent, factual statement was met with a form of sympathetic condescension that made clear it was being filed under interesting delusion rather than accepted as straightforward communication. The way that distress was taken as confirmation of illness rather than as a reasonable response to being locked in a building against your will. The epistemological trap was almost perfect. You could not demonstrate your sanity within a system that had already classified your self-assessment as unreliable, and yet they kept trying, letter after letter, testimony after testimony, account after account, written in the knowledge that they might never be read, or that if they were read, they might not be believed, but written anyway, because the alternative was to accept the institution's definition of who they were. And that, for many of them, was the one thing they absolutely would not do. The women who worked in the day to day care of patients in Victorian asylums were among the most essential and most invisible people in the entire institution. Without them, nothing functioned. Without their knowledge of individual patients, their physical labor through the long shifts, their presence on the wards at 2 in the morning when everything else had gone quiet, the asylums would have been simply unmanageable, and yet they appear in the official histories of psychiatry almost not at all. A footnote to the story of the superintendents, those medically qualified men whose names appear in the annual reports and the scholarly journals. They were called attendants or nurses, or in some institutions simply keepers. The title shifted across the century and across different types of institution, but the role was essentially consistent to manage the daily physical and social lives of the patients under their care, to wake them in the morning and settle them at night, to oversee washing and dressing for those who could not fully manage independently, to supervise meals in the dining halls and work periods in the laundry and sewing rooms, to keep order on the ward during the day and to maintain something like safety through the night, to be present continuously in the immediate physical environment of people who were sometimes acutely distressed, sometimes physically dangerous, and almost always in need of more individual attention than the staffing ratios of the institution could provide. The women who took these positions came predominantly from the working class, and they came because the job offered something that was genuinely valuable to women of limited means in the Victorian period: stability. The wages were low, typically between 12 and 18 pounds a year in the mid-Victorian period, rising somewhat toward the end of the century, but they included room and board inside the institution. This meant that an unmarried woman, or a widow, or a woman who had no family to fall back on, could take a position as an attendant and know that she had a roof over her head and food in her stomach for as long as she kept the job. In a period before any meaningful social safety net existed, this was not nothing. What the job required was considerable, and the women who took it were rarely given much formal preparation for what they would encounter. Training in the first half of the Victorian period was essentially non existent as a formal matter. A new attendant was shown around the ward by whoever was leaving the position she was filling, or by a senior colleague who had time enough to walk her through the basics before the next crisis required attention. She learned by watching and by doing, on wards that might contain women in the grip of acute psychosis, women who had been inside the institution for decades and knew every inch of it better than she did, women who were medically frail alongside women who were physically robust and occasionally violent. The hours were extraordinary. The standard shift in the mid-Victorian asylum stretched across 12 to 14 hours for day staff, and the night attendant was expected to be available throughout the night, not necessarily awake every moment, but present, sleeping lightly in a chair by the dormitory door, and rising whenever the sounds of distress required her. The institution never closed, which meant neither did her workday in any meaningful sense. She slept inside the building, in a room separated from the patient's dormitory by not much more than a wall and a door. Her life and the institution's life were almost completely merged. Most asylums required their female attendants to remain unmarried as a condition of employment. Marriage was considered incompatible with the level of residential commitment that the role demanded, and it raised the prospect of divided loyalties and complicated domestic arrangements that the institution preferred not to deal with. This was a condition that significantly shaped the demographic of the workforce. The women who stayed in asylum work for years or decades tended to be those for whom the institution had become, in a meaningful sense, their life. Their colleagues were their social circle, the wards were their home, the patients were, in a complicated and not always comfortable way, their community. The relationship between attendants and patients was one of the most interesting and least examined features of the Victorian asylum. On paper, the hierarchy was absolute. The attendant had authority over the patient in almost every aspect of daily life. In practice, the relationship was far more complex. An experienced attendant who had worked the same ward for 5 or 10 years knew her patients in ways that no one else in the institution did. She knew which patient's agitation at nightfall was a sign of genuine distress that needed attention, and which patient was simply expressing a long standing habit that was better managed by quiet acknowledgement than by intervention. She knew who responded to music and who found it irritating. She knew who needed to be spoken to gently and who found excessive gentleness condescending. She knew the whole social world of the ward, the friendships, the resentments, the hierarchies that patients had formed among themselves, and she navigated it constantly. This knowledge was never formally recorded, never officially valued, and never professionally recognized in any way that the institution acknowledged. It lived in the body and the memory of the attendant herself, and when she retired or left or died, it went with her. But it was real, and it was the thing that made the difference, day after day, between a ward that was merely controlled and a ward where something recognizable as human care was actually taking place. The official record of asylum attendant culture contains its share of documented abuse, and it would be dishonest to minimize this. Physical coercion, striking patients, restraining them roughly, confining them in side rooms for hours as punishment for behavior that was inconvenient rather than dangerous, was officially condemned throughout much of the Victorian period by the non-restraint advocates who had been gaining influence since the 1840s. It was also stubbornly persistent in practice because the structural conditions that produced it, chronic overwork, insufficient supervision, inadequate training, the isolation of the wards from any meaningful outside oversight, were never adequately addressed. Attendants were dismissed when their behavior was documented and reported. The behavior continued in the next intake. But alongside this, and just as real, was something else. Attendants who stayed with difficult patients through the worst nights, asking nothing in return, who brought small comforts, an extra blanket, a piece of fruit, a few minutes of conversation that the institution did not require them to provide, and that no one would have noticed if they had withheld, who learned the names of their patients' children and asked about them, who noticed when a patient was deteriorating before any formal clinical sign had appeared, and who found ways to ensure that someone with the authority to act was made aware. These things were also real. They were also the texture of what asylum care actually was, in the hours and days and years that the official record does not document. Every Victorian asylum had at its official apex a medical superintendent. He was a qualified physician. His name appeared on all the official correspondence. He testified before the lunacy commissioners during their formal inspections. He wrote the annual report that went to the governing committee and through them to the public. He was the institutional face of the establishment, and his authority within it was formally comprehensive. But every Victorian asylum also had a matron, and understanding what the matron actually did and how she actually functioned within the institution requires setting aside the official hierarchy and looking instead at the informal one, the one that actually governed the daily life of the female wards. The matron's formal responsibilities were substantial and demanding. She was responsible for the supervision of all female nursing and domestic staff. She managed the domestic economy of the female side of the institution, the linen store, the laundry schedule, the cleaning rosters, the kitchen arrangements for the female wards, the ordering of domestic supplies, the maintenance of the basic physical standards that determined whether the institution was clean, orderly, and adequately provisioned. She was responsible for the daily welfare of female patients in every respect that was not explicitly medical, which in practice meant almost every respect that actually shaped the texture of a patient's daily experience. She was also, in virtually every institution, the person through whom any woman patient's concerns, complaints, or needs had to be filtered before they could reach the medical staff. Doctors visited the wards, but their visits were scheduled and circumscribed. The matron was there every day. She knew every patient. She knew the state of every ward. She knew which patients were deteriorating before the clinical picture had fully clarified. She knew which patients were improving. She knew what was actually happening in the institution, as opposed to what the annual report described. The formal hierarchy gave her no authority over medical decisions, no standing to challenge the superintendent's clinical judgments, no official channel through which to raise concerns that existed outside her specifically domestic remit. But the informal reality was a considerably more complicated. A skilled and experienced matron with years in the institution and the confidence of the governing committee was not simply a domestic manager. She was a political figure in the small and very real politics of the asylum. She had relationships, she had knowledge, she had the standing that comes from being the person who is actually present and who actually knows. And some matrons used these things to remarkable effect. The historical record contains, scattered through inspection reports and committee minutes and the occasional institutional memoir, traces of matrons who pushed back against practices they considered harmful. A matron who formally documented an attendant's rough treatment of a patient and insisted in writing on an inquiry at the cost of considerable friction with colleagues who considered this a betrayal. A matron who wrote directly to the governing committee to report on deteriorating conditions in the domestic supply of the female wards after the superintendent had failed to act on her verbal concerns. A matron who arranged for a patient's letter to be posted without being read by the censorship process, having made a private judgment that the woman's account of her situation was credible and that the letter needed to reach its destination. These were not small acts. They happened in institutional contexts where the matron's housing, her income, and her professional reputation were all entirely dependent on her continued good standing with the medical superintendent and the governing committee. To challenge either was to risk everything she had. And yet the record shows that some matrons did it anyway, with caution, with calculation, and with a form of moral seriousness that the institutions they served rarely formally acknowledged. There was also, in the better run institutions, a more cooperative dynamic between the matron and the medical superintendent, one in which her knowledge of the patients and the wards was treated as genuinely valuable rather than merely auxiliary. Some superintendents were explicit about their reliance on the matron's judgment. The inspection reports of the lunacy commissioners occasionally noted, with evident approval, the quality of a specific matron's management, the orderliness of her wards, the evident morale of her nursing staff, the condition of her patients. These commendations were never accompanied by a salary commensurate with the responsibility being described, but they were at least a form of official recognition. The matron was not a revolutionary. She was not, in most cases, interested in overturning the institution she had given her professional life to. What she was, in the best cases, was someone with a precise and grounded understanding of the difference between an institution that was merely functional and one that was genuinely humane, and a sufficient sense of her own authority, even within the official constraints on it, to push consistently toward the latter. That is a different kind of power from the one on the organizational chart. But in the daily life of the women in her care, it was often the one that mattered most. While the matrons and attendants worked to shape asylum life from within, and while the patients themselves pushed back against the terms of their confinement in the ways available to them, there was another group of women who engaged with the asylum from the outside, who made it their project in the public sphere to make visible what the walls concealed and to demand that something be done about it. They came to this project from different directions. Some were former patients whose direct experience of the institution gave their advocacy an authority that no amount of secondhand research could replicate. Some were middle class philanthropists and social reformers who had encountered the asylum world through a family member's experience or through the kind of visiting work that respectable Victorian women were encouraged to do in hospitals, prisons, and other institutions as an expression of their charitable impulses. Some were journalists working in a period when investigative reporting on institutional conditions was beginning to develop as a recognizable genre. Some were explicitly aligned with the emerging women's rights movement, which increasingly included asylum reform among the causes that most clearly illustrated the consequences of women's legal and political subordination. Louisa Lowe's Lunacy Law Reform Society was the most sustained organizational expression of this energy, but it was not alone. The alleged Lunatics' Friends Society, which predated it, had been founded in 1845, partly by John Percival, son of a former British Prime Minister and himself a former asylum patient, and its membership and correspondence networks extended across the country. Women who had experienced wrongful confinement, or who were advocating on behalf of people who had found their way to these organizations, and through them to one another. The atmosphere of mutual reinforcement this created was important. A woman who had been confined and released, and who wanted to speak about it, was operating in an environment where her credibility was automatically compromised by the fact of her prior certification. The medical establishment and many members of the public would reflexively interpret her account of her experience through the lens of her diagnosis, which had already established her as an unreliable narrator of her own mental states. This was the fundamental epistemological trap of advocacy by former patients, and it was not easily escaped. What organizations and networks provided was the possibility of accumulation, the gathering together of enough individual accounts that the pattern became harder to dismiss than any single case. When Louisa Lowe published pamphlets documenting not one case, but 30 or 50, when she could demonstrate not a single anomaly, but a systematic pattern, the argument shifted. It became less about whether any individual woman was telling the truth about her own experience, and more about what the consistent shape of many women's experiences implied about the system that had produced them. Frances Power Cobbe was one of the most prominent and prolific Victorian feminist writers, and she brought to asylum reform the same analytical intelligence she applied to every other area of women's legal and social subordination. In her journalism, she connected the ease of wrongful confinement directly to the broader legal framework that treated married women as their husbands' dependents, a framework in which the lunacy laws were not an anomaly but a logical extension. She argued with clarity that reads as remarkably current that you cannot separate the question of who gets to decide a woman is insane from the question of who holds legal and economic power in the relationship between men and women. The vote, she contended, was not a luxury, but a necessity. Without political power, women had no mechanism for changing the laws that governed their lives, and the lunacy laws were among the most consequential of those. The investigative journalism of the period contributed to the reform conversation in ways that sometimes moved faster than advocacy organizations could. The sensation that Nellie Bly's 1887 self-commitment to the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island in New York, created on both sides of the Atlantic, illustrated the power of experiential reportage to cut through official reassurances in a way that even the most meticulously documented pamphlet could not always manage. Bly had spent 10 days inside the institution, observing and recording everything she could. Her published account, 10 Days in a Madhouse, described conditions that bore little resemblance to the official descriptions of the institution. The public response was immediate. A grand jury investigation followed. The asylum's funding was increased and its conditions improved. The story demonstrated that what happened behind closed institutional doors could be made visible, that visibility created pressure, and that pressure sometimes produced change. Literature worked alongside journalism, reaching audiences that factual reporting might not touch, and creating emotional frameworks within which the factual arguments could be received. The sensation novels of the 1860s, read avidly across class boundaries, had made the figure of the wrongfully confined woman a recognizable cultural presence. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, published in 1892, went further. Its narrator is not confined in an asylum, but under medical orders in a rented house, subject to the rest cure prescribed by her physician husband, confined to a single room, forbidden to write or to work or to think, her own perceptions of her situation systematically discounted by every authority around her. The story is a horror story. It is also an essentially accurate description of the epistemological condition that Louisa Lowe and many others had described in their factual accounts. The woman who knows that what is happening to her is wrong, but who exists within a system that has already classified her knowledge as unreliable. Gilman wrote the story out of her own experience of the rest cure and intended it as a direct protest. It remains one of the most precise literary accounts of what it felt like to be a woman inside the Victorian medical system. For most of the Victorian period, the women who worked in asylum wards had nothing that could be called a professional identity. They were working class women doing difficult physical work in an institution, receiving wages and board in exchange for their labor. They were not members of a profession. There was no professional organization that claimed them. There was no formal qualification that distinguished the experienced and skilled from the new and untested. They were, in the official imagination of the institution, essentially interchangeable. The transformation of this situation over the last 2 decades of the Victorian period is one of the most significant developments in the history of psychiatric care, and it happened as part of a broader transformation in the status and self understanding of nursing that had its origins well outside the asylum world. Florence Nightingale's work had begun to reshape the public understanding of what nursing was and could be from the 1850s onward, and the Nightingale Training School at St. Thomas's Hospital, opened in 1860, created a model for formal nurse education that proved enormously influential even in contexts very different from the one it was designed for. Nightingale's own views on asylum nursing were complicated. She was skeptical that the training model she had developed for general hospitals could be simply transplanted into the very different environment of the asylum, and she was right about that skepticism. But the broader principle that nursing was a skilled occupation, requiring formal training and deserving of professional recognition, was one that the asylum world could not permanently resist, even if it engaged with it slowly and on its own terms. The Medico-Psychological Association, the professional body for asylum physicians, created the first formal nursing certificate specifically for asylum workers in 1891, after years of discussion and a significant amount of internal resistance from members who worried about the implications of a formally qualified nursing workforce. The certificate covered anatomy and physiology, the basic principles of mental illness as understood by the medicine of the period, first aid, and the specific practical skills involved in caring for patients with mental illness. It required a defined period of supervised training and a formal examination. It was nationally recognized across the asylum system. The significance of this cannot be overstated, though it is easy to underestimate from a contemporary perspective, in which professional certification is simply taken for granted. For the women who worked in asylum wards, the certificate represented recognition, formal, public, institutional acknowledgement that what they did was skilled work, not simply labor. It was something that belonged to them rather than to the institution, a credential they carried with them if they moved between establishments, that identified them as competent practitioners rather than simply as employees of a particular asylum. It gave them, for the first time, something that approximated a professional identity. The uptake was gradual and uneven across the country. Some superintendents embraced the training program enthusiastically, seeing in it the possibility of a more competent and more manageable nursing workforce. Others were more cautious. The concern, rarely stated explicitly, but clearly present in the subtext of institutional discussions, was that formally trained nurses with professional qualifications and a developed sense of their own expertise might be more difficult to manage than untrained attendants whose entire standing within the institution depended on their compliance with its rules. A nurse who knew her professional obligations might feel entitled to raise concerns about practices that a simple attendant might not dare to question. This concern was not entirely unfounded. The trajectory of asylum nursing through the Edwardian period and into the early 20th century shows a workforce that was, in important ways, gradually developing a clearer sense of its own professional responsibilities, including the responsibility to advocate for patients and to report practices that fell below acceptable standards. This process was slow and incomplete and continuously undermined by the structural conditions of low pay, long hours, and institutional isolation. But it was real, and its roots lay in the professionalization push of the 1880s and 1890s. The women who trained for and obtained the Medico Psychological Association certificate were, in a meaningful sense, making a claim about what they were: not servants, not keepers, not women doing dirty work in an institution, nurses, professionals with defined competencies and professional obligations. The claim was incomplete, and the recognition it received was inadequate to the reality of their work. But it was a beginning, and beginning is never nothing. This is the part of the story where I want to slow down considerably, because I think there is something important in the texture of the daily, in what it actually felt and smelled and sounded like to be inside one of these institutions, whether as a patient or as someone who worked there. The large historical forces are real and significant, but they operated through specific bodies in specific rooms on specific days. It is worth trying to be present in that specificity. The physical architecture of the Victorian County Asylum was designed with a therapeutic intention that its architects took seriously. The great institutions built in the mid-Victorian period were enormous, sometimes half a mile of corridor from one end to the other, but they were designed to be orderly and well lit and as comfortable as the prevailing theories of mental health management suggested they should be. Wide corridors with large windows, day rooms with high ceilings designed to minimize the sense of confinement. Airing courts, the walled outdoor areas where patients could take exercise, that some institutions developed over time into genuine gardens with paths and flower beds and the possibility of something that felt, in glimpses, like ordinary life. The dormitories were large, typically holding between 20 and 40 patients in rows of narrow iron-framed beds. By the later Victorian period, individual beds were standard in most institutions, an improvement over the practice of the earlier decades, when patients might share a bed. Curtains between beds were unusual. Privacy was essentially non-existent. The dormitory was a shared space in every sense: shared air, shared warmth or cold, shared sounds. Patients became intimate in involuntary ways with the habits and the distress of the women sleeping within a few feet of them. The morning routine began early, 5:30 or 6 in summer, somewhat later in winter, and it was managed with the same precision as everything else in the institution. Rising, dressing, washing, the movement of the wards from the dormitories to the dining hall for breakfast. The food was plain and institutional: porridge, bread, weak tea in the mornings, boiled meat or stew with vegetables at midday, bread and cheese or cold leftovers in the evening. The quantities were generally adequate by the standards of working class life in the Victorian period, though rarely generous, and the quality varied enormously from institution to institution and from decade to decade. By the later Victorian period, the Lunacy Commissioner's inspection reports regularly included comments on the state of the food as a metric of the institution's general quality of care. After breakfast came work. The asylum's economy was built on patient labor, and this was justified both practically and therapeutically. The practical justification was simple. The institutions were enormous and needed enormous amounts of domestic work to function, and paying a full workforce to do that work would have cost far more than the county ratepayers were willing to spend. The therapeutic justification was more elaborate and more contested. The prevailing theory of moral management held that structured occupation was beneficial for disturbed minds, that the habits of industry and routine were foundational to mental health, and that work in the laundry or the kitchen or the garden was genuinely part of the treatment. The laundry deserves particular attention because it was the single largest employer of patient labor in almost every asylum and the place where the gap between therapeutic justification and economic exploitation was most visible. The laundry of a large asylum was a substantial industrial operation, handling the sheets, clothing, nightgowns, towels, uniforms, and linens of hundreds or thousands of people. Women worked at the copper boilers and the mangles and the drying racks for hours at a stretch, in rooms that were perpetually hot and humid, breathing the steam that rose from the washing and the fumes from the lye soap. Their hands cracked and reddened from the repeated cycles of wet and heat and chemical. They were performing essential economic work for the institution, work that would have cost real money to have done otherwise, framed as therapy that was benefiting them. Sewing was the other major occupation of the female wards, and it was easier on the body if not on the eyes, particularly for older patients. The sewing rooms produced the clothing and the mending that the institution required, and they could, in the right conditions, be almost peaceful. This was not a room full of women quietly at work, conversation sometimes permitted by attendants who judged that low voices and occupied hands were compatible with good order. Some women who had been skilled needlewomen before their admission found in the sewing room a context in which something of their former competence and identity was still accessible to them. This mattered more than it might seem. The afternoons held in good weather, the walk in the airing court, round and round the enclosed space, in loose groups, supervised from the edges. In the earlier Victorian period, the courts were bare and functional: walls, ground, the sky above, and little else. In later decades, some institutions made real efforts to improve them. Gardens were planted, benches were installed, women were allowed to sit as well as to walk. The improvement sounds modest in the telling and was significant in the living. The difference between a space that denied all sensory pleasure and a space that offered the occasional mercy of a flower or a patch of sunlight on a bench. The evenings contracted early. Patients returned to their dormitories at hours that varied by season and by institution, but were consistently earlier than the nightfall of the outside world. The day rooms offered whatever entertainment the institution provided. In the better establishments, a piano, books, the occasional organized reading or musical performance. In the more basic establishments, the evening hours were simply waiting, sitting in a large room under supervision until the time came to be moved to the dormitory and the lights were put out. And then the night. The sounds of a dormitory full of women who were rarely all asleep at the same time, the breathing and the turning and the occasional cry that cut through the dark. The attendant dozing by the door, rising when she needed to, settling again. The institutional building moving around its inhabitants, the creak of old timbers, the sound of wind against large windows, the distant sounds from other wards that seeped through thick walls. Some women described the nights as the most difficult part of the asylum experience. Others found, in the relative quiet and dimness of the dormitory, after the managed intensity of the day, something that was almost a rest. This was the shape of the days, not dramatic mostly, not the theatrical madness of popular imagination, just the slow, heavy, repetitive rhythm of institutional time, of days that were structured identically, week after week, month after month, until the patient's own internal sense of time became disoriented and the institution's schedule became the only reliable framework for experience. The question of how a woman got out of a Victorian asylum is one that the official accounts of these institutions address in terms that sound straightforward and reasonable. A patient who had recovered, whose mental state had improved to the point where she no longer required institutional care and could be safely returned to the community, was assessed by the medical superintendent, recommended for discharge, and released into the care of a family member or an approved sponsor. The process was regular and well managed. The system worked. The reality was considerably more complicated and, for many women, considerably less reassuring. The fundamental problem was structural. The decision about whether a patient had recovered rested entirely with the medical superintendent, whose assessment was filtered through the same diagnostic framework that had produced the admission in the first place. A patient who presented as calm and cooperative and deferential was more likely to be described as improved than a patient who continued to protest her confinement, even if the latter's protests were entirely coherent and the former's calm reflected compliance rather than genuine recovery. The incentive structure of the institution rewarded certain kinds of behavior, quiet, industrious, deferential, and labeled those behaviors as health. It penalized other kinds, protest, refusal, persistence, and labeled those behaviors as symptoms. The woman who had the clearest grounds for discharge was often the one least likely to present in the way that the institution's definition of recovery required. Beyond the assessment, there was the requirement for a sponsor, a family member or approved person willing to take formal responsibility for the patient's welfare outside the institution. For women whose families had committed them and had no interest in receiving them back, this requirement was an insuperable obstacle. There was no one coming. The institution was not going to release a patient into homelessness and destitution. She stayed. The long stay population that accumulated in the great Victorian county asylums as a result of this structural problem was enormous. Some of the women in these institutions had arrived as young women and would die there 30 or 40 or 50 years later, having spent the majority of their adult lives within the same set of walls. Their needs had become entirely institutionalized. They did not know how to cook for themselves, to manage money, to navigate the world outside. Even if a sponsor had materialized, the prospect of release would have been terrifying rather than simply liberating. The institution had remade them, and the remaking was not reversible by simple discharge. The women who did manage to leave did so through various routes. Some genuinely recovered from whatever had brought them in and were assessed as improved by superintendents who were willing to make that judgment. Some had family members who changed their minds, whose circumstances shifted in ways that made receiving the woman back possible or desirable. Some had advocates, lawyers, journalists, members of reform organizations, who pressed their cases publicly enough that the institution found it easier to release them than to defend their continued detention. A very few escaped physically, documented in the asylum registers with the flatness of institutional record keeping. Absconded from the airing court on a Tuesday afternoon, not recaptured. The women who left faced a world that had continued without them. Husbands who had made other arrangements, children who had grown up in their absence, and who were sometimes strangers by the time of the reunion. Social positions that had been filled. The stigma of having been in the asylum, of having been officially certified as insane, was severe and lasting. It affected employment prospects, marriage prospects, and the simple social standing that determined how people were treated in daily interactions. Many former patients spent years or decades dealing with the consequences of the certification, even after the confinement itself had ended. And yet, and this is the part that the official record tends to overlook, many of them managed, many of them built lives, found work, formed relationships, raised children. Some of them became advocates. Some of them disappeared entirely into the ordinary, which was perhaps exactly what they had always wanted, to be ordinary women in an ordinary world, unremarkable and unmarked, free to be as eccentric or as quiet or as unconventional as they chose, without anyone deciding that their unconventionality required a diagnosis. The legal framework governing the confinement of the mentally ill in Victorian Britain was not static. It was argued over, inspected, criticized, and revised throughout the period, though always more slowly than reformers demanded, and always with more attention to administrative tidiness than to the actual lived experience of the people inside the institutions. The Lunacy Act of 1845, which had created the formal county asylum system and the Lunacy Commission to oversee it, had been a significant piece of legislation in its time. It established that people could not be confined in county asylums without medical certification, that institutions must be inspected regularly, and that the commissioners must submit annual reports to Parliament. These were genuine reforms over the more chaotic and unregulated system that had preceded them. But the Act's protections were weak in exactly the areas where abuse was most likely to occur. The certification requirement was too easy to satisfy. The Commission's inspection powers were substantial on paper, but limited in practice. Inspectors visited, wrote their reports, noted deficiencies, and recommended improvements, but had limited authority to compel the changes they identified as necessary. The rights of patients to contest their certification or to appeal their continued detention were minimal. The pressure for stronger legislative protection built steadily through the 1860s and 1870s, fed by a succession of high profile cases, Rosina Bulwer Lytton's being only the most visible, that demonstrated how easily the existing system could be weaponized. Parliamentary debates on lunacy reform became regular features of the legislative calendar. Questions were asked, committees were convened, reports were written, and the medical establishment, which had a significant interest in preserving its discretionary authority over committal decisions, lobbied vigorously against reforms that would have constrained it. The result was the Lunacy Act of 1890, which represented the most significant legislative change to the asylum system in the Victorian period. It tightened the certification requirements substantially. More medical signatures were needed, with greater independence from the person seeking committal required. A magistrate's order was now required in most cases for admission to a pauper asylum. The rights of patients to have their cases reviewed were strengthened. The record keeping requirements were made more stringent. The act was a genuine improvement. It made casual misuse of the committal process more difficult, particularly for the middle class cases that generated the most public attention. It created greater formal accountability. It did not transform the daily experience of women inside the asylums. The long stay chronic population was barely affected. They were already inside, and the new rules governed admission rather than continued detention. The culture of the wards, the quality of care, the relationships between staff and patients, the basic conditions of daily life changed slowly and unevenly, driven more by the gradual shift in professional culture that professionalization of nursing was producing than by anything the 1890 Act directly mandated. The fundamental dynamic by which a woman's own account of her experience was treated as less reliable than an institutional assessment of it remained intact. The diagnostic categories that had swallowed so many women remained in use. Reform, in the history of institutions, almost always works this way. The legal changes come in response to the most egregious and most visible abuses, and they address those abuses while leaving intact the structural conditions that produce less visible, less easily named forms of harm. The Victorian asylum's greatest harms were not always the dramatic ones that made the newspapers. They were the quieter harms of chronic confinement, of the substitution of institutional routine for actual life, of the systematic delegitimization of women's own understanding of their experience. These harms were real, and they were harder to legislate against, and they changed more slowly than the laws did. Not everything that happened to women with mental illness in the Victorian period happened inside the county asylum system. Alongside the great public institutions, there existed a range of alternative forms of care, some of them explicitly designed as alternatives to the asylum model, and the women who created and sustained these alternatives deserve a place in the story. Private madhouses, small, usually residential institutions that provided care for paying patients, had existed since the 18th century and continued throughout the Victorian period alongside the public system. The quality of these establishments varied enormously. The best of them offered considerably more individual attention and more comfortable physical conditions than the county asylums. The worst were little better than secure residences for people whose families wanted them out of sight, with minimal care and no meaningful oversight until the Lunacy Commission's inspection powers were strengthened. Charitable institutions provided another alternative. Bethlehem Royal Hospital, Bedlam, the oldest and most famous psychiatric institution in Britain, dating from the medieval period, had transitioned by the Victorian era from its earlier horrifying model. In the 18th century, public viewing of the inmates as a form of entertainment had been a feature of the institution, into something that aspired to the moral management model that reformers had been advocating. The Sisters of Mercy and other religious sisterhoods ran small nursing homes for women with mental illness, particularly for Catholic patients, that attempted to integrate spiritual care with the domestic management of illness. What is perhaps most interesting in the landscape of alternative care is the way that women, as founders, administrators, and practitioners in these alternative institutions, sometimes found it possible to create environments that operated on different principles from the county asylum model. The nursing sisterhoods brought a specific vision of care rooted in religious vocation rather than medical authority. The philanthropic women who served on the governing committees of charitable institutions brought perspectives shaped by their own experience of managing large households and of advocating for dependent people within systems not designed for their welfare. These alternative contexts were not free of the same diagnostic assumptions and the same gendered power dynamics that characterize the mainstream system. The women who ran them were not in most cases interested in overturning the medical authority of the physicians they worked alongside. They operated within the frameworks available to them, but within those frameworks, they sometimes created something recognizably different in quality from what the county asylums provided at their most basic. The broader significance of these alternatives is perhaps less about what they achieved in the Victorian period than about what they prefigured. The idea that people with mental illness might be best served by smaller, less institutionalized, more individually attentive forms of care, an idea that the nursing sisterhoods were practicing in Victorian England and the philanthropic charitable institutions were attempting to operationalize, would not become mainstream policy until well into the 20th century. But it was already being thought and practiced in small and underfunded forms by women who had not waited for the medical establishment to tell them it was a good idea. History at the scale of institutions and legislation is important, but it risks losing sight of the thing that matters most: that every patient who passed through the doors of a Victorian asylum was a specific person with a specific face and a specific history and a specific internal life that the institution was not designed to see. Let me try for a few moments to be more specific. The admission register of Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, which survives in the London Metropolitan Archives, records the entry on a Thursday afternoon in November 1873 of a woman described as a laundress, aged 34, admitted with the diagnosis of mania. The reason for admission is listed as domestic trouble. She was married, her husband brought her. The notes from her first week describe agitation and refusal to sleep. The notes from a month later describe her as settled and working in the laundry. She was discharged 2 years later into her husband's care, 2 years of her life, working in the institutional laundry of a large asylum, performing the same work she had done to earn her living before her admission. The record does not say what the domestic trouble was. It does not say what happened after she went home. The case notes of a patient at Bethlehem in the 1880s, a woman in her late 20s, the daughter of a clergyman, admitted with the diagnosis of melancholia, contains something unusual, several pages of the patient's own writing, apparently submitted to the medical officer in response to a request that she describe her feelings. The writing is lucid, carefully organized, and deeply sad. She describes the experience of being in the asylum as having removed her from the only contexts in which she understood herself. She writes about the loss of access to books, to music, to the conversations with specific people that had made her life meaningful. She does not claim to be well. She claims only that the institution is making her worse, not better, and that what she needs is not management, but restoration of the conditions in which she might manage herself. The medical notes alongside her writing characterize it as evidence of a disordered self regard and an excessive attachment to the comforts of ordinary life. She was detained for another year after writing it. Mary Ann Clark entered the nursing staff of the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum in Wakefield in 1878 at the age of 26, following several years in domestic service. She worked on the female wards for 19 years. During that time, according to the inspection reports that mentioned her by name, she was consistently described as one of the most competent and most trusted nurses on the female side of the institution. She completed the Medico-Psychological Association certificate in 1893. She was appointed to a senior position on the admissions ward in 1895, responsible for the first reception and assessment of newly arrived patients, the most sensitive and consequential point in a patient's institutional career. She retired in 1897, and the record offers nothing further. 19 years, thousands of patients whose introduction to the asylum was managed by her hands. These three women, unnamed laundress, unnamed clergyman's daughter, named nurse, stand for many thousands whose names are in the registers, or the case files, or the inspection reports, or whose names are not in any surviving record at all. They are the actual texture of this history, not the legislation and the medical theories and the reform campaigns, but the specific days and specific rooms and specific hands and specific words that all of that abstraction operated through. To remember them, even this imperfectly and briefly, is to refuse a small part of the erasure that the institution intended. The great Victorian county asylums are almost entirely gone now, at least in their original form. Colney Hatch is luxury apartments. Princess Park Manor, the development is called, which would have struck the patients who shuffled along its corridors as a detail of almost hallucinatory incongruity. Hanwell is partly demolished and partly converted. Cane Hill in Coulsdon, one of the most architecturally imposing of the Victorian institutions, was left derelict for decades and then demolished in stages, its water tower surviving as a residential landmark in a new housing development. Rainhill, Prestwich, Clayberry, the same story in different combinations of demolition and conversion and partial survival. The mental health system that replaced them was built on different principles, or at least on principles that were articulated differently. Care in the community became the dominant model in Britain from the 1960s onward, accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s as the long stay wards were finally emptied and the buildings closed or sold. The idea was that people with mental illness should live in the world, supported by community services, rather than being removed from it and placed in large institutions where the removal itself became one of the most significant problems to be overcome. The idea was right. Its implementation was, and continues to be, incomplete in ways that are consequential for the most vulnerable people in the mental health system. The community services that were supposed to replace the asylum were never funded adequately. The housing that people with serious mental illness need in order to live in the community was never provided in sufficient quantity or quality. The result, documented repeatedly over the decades since institutionalization, has been that the closure of the asylums has been followed not by the flourishing of people with mental illness in a supported community, but by their appearance in other institutions, prisons, homeless shelters, emergency departments, or by an absence of support that has had its own severe consequences. The Victorian asylum's worst features were its most visible and most easily defined: the wrongful confinement, the physical coercion, the diagnostic categories that pathologized the ordinary experience of women's lives. These features have been legislated against, campaigned against, and largely, though not entirely, eliminated from the formal psychiatric system. The Lunacy Acts gave way to the Mental Health Act, which has been revised and strengthened multiple times, and which now provides, on paper, considerably stronger protections for the rights of people subject to compulsory psychiatric treatment. But the more fundamental questions that the Victorian asylum raised about who gets to define sanity, about whose account of their own experience is treated as reliable, about the relationship between poverty and marginalization and psychiatric diagnosis, about the gendered dimensions of medicalization, these questions have not been resolved. They have been restated in new language, subjected to new academic analysis, made the subject of new legislation and new professional guidelines. They remain live and contested. Women continue to be diagnosed with certain psychiatric conditions at significantly higher rates than men. The history of specific diagnostic categories, from Victorian hysteria through 20th century diagnoses like borderline personality disorder, has been examined critically by feminist scholars who identify the same pattern: behaviors that are distressing or inconvenient to others, particularly to men, being pathologized in women, while equivalent behaviors in men are managed through different social and institutional mechanisms. The pattern is not identical to what it was in the Victorian period. It is not unrecognizable from it either. The nurses who work in psychiatric settings today are the professional descendants of the Victorian attendants who sat by dormitory doors in the small hours of the morning. The ward managers who navigate the gap between institutional hierarchy and genuine patient advocacy are doing what the best Victorian matrons did: making a flawed system function as humanely as possible using the tools they have, one day at a time, mostly without adequate recognition and usually without adequate pay. And the patients who write about their experiences inside psychiatric institutions today, the accounts published in memoirs, in blogs, in the growing body of service user testimony that the mental health system is slowly and inconsistently learning to take seriously, are continuing the project that Louisa Lowe began when she sat down after her release in 1872 and started writing, carefully and with great precision and barely contained fury, about what she had seen and experienced and survived. The thread is long, the buildings are gone, the language has changed enormously, the specific diagnostic categories are different. The legal framework is unrecognizable, but the women are still here, still watching, still writing, still insisting, against whatever form the resistance currently takes, on the reliability of their own experience. One of the things that former patients most consistently described in their written accounts of the Victorian asylum was the particular quality of its sounds. The institution had an acoustic character that was almost impossible to convey to anyone who had not experienced it, and that became, for many of the women confined within it, one of the most disorienting features of daily life. Not the dramatic sounds one might expect from popular images of the asylum, but the mundane, relentless, institutional sounds that came to define every hour of the day. During the day, the sounds were layered and constant. The clatter of the dining hall during meal times, the scrape of chairs on stone floors, the particular resonance of institutional crockery, the low collective murmur of hundreds of women eating in a space designed for efficient management rather than comfortable conversation, the rhythmic thudding of the laundry mangles carrying through the walls from the lower floors, the hiss of steam from the copper boilers, the footsteps of attendants on the corridor floors, a sound that experienced patients learned to read with considerable precision, distinguishing the measured walk of a relaxed attendant on routine rounds from the quickened step that meant something had happened somewhere that required urgent attention. The distant sounds from the locked wards seeping through thick walls, sometimes merely unusual and sometimes deeply distressing to hear. And there was music. This is one of the things about Victorian asylum life that tends to genuinely surprise people encountering the history for the first time. The centrality of music to the institutional routine in the better managed establishments was not incidental. It was deliberate and it was taken seriously. The piano in the day room was not a decorative gesture toward civilization. It was a therapeutic tool, actively used. Some institutions employed or recruited from among their patients women who could play and who were encouraged to do so during the long afternoon hours when other occupation was limited. Singing was common. Organized musical evenings were a standard feature of the better Victorian asylum social calendar, not concerts performed for passive patients, but events in which patients themselves participated as performers, choosing pieces, rehearsing, performing before an audience of their fellow patients. The sense of competence and agency that even a small performance could restore to a woman who had been stripped of almost every other form of autonomy was recognized, at least intuitively, by the more thoughtful superintendents. The annual dance was the most elaborate expression of this musical culture. Several times a year, At Christmas and sometimes at other seasons, the great dining hall of a county asylum might be cleared and decorated with whatever greenery and fabric the institution could provide, and patients from the male and female wards would be allowed to mix under supervision for an evening of dancing to a small ensemble of musicians, sometimes hired from outside, sometimes assembled from among the patients and staff themselves. The reports of these events in institutional annual reports are written with a warmth that reads almost comically against the gray administrative language surrounding them. The events were real, and by patient testimony, they were often genuinely valued. In a world of almost total institutional control, a few hours of music and movement and the mixed social company that ordinary life was full of, but the asylum systematically denied, represented something that was experienced as genuine pleasure. The nights were different in character entirely. The dormitory at night had its own acoustic world, distinct from the day. The sound of collective breathing, many people sleeping in proximity, the small unconscious sounds of sleep, the occasional deeper irregularity signaling a bad dream or an approaching moment of wakefulness. The building itself contributed its own sounds, old stone and timber contracting in the cold, producing the particular noises that old buildings make in the dark, the creaks and settlings, and occasional sharp cracks that could jolt a lightly sleeping person into full alertness with a heart suddenly very loud in the chest. Women who were sensitive to sound found the communal dormitory one of the most difficult features of institutional life. The loss of solitude, of the possibility of a quiet space that was their own, was described by many former patients as one of the deprivations hardest to articulate to people who had never experienced its absence. It was not dramatic. It did not leave visible marks, but it was continuous, and its continuousness was its cumulative power. And yet, alongside everything that was difficult about the communal life of the institution, something else coexisted in the same dormitory space. The dormitory was also the place where genuine friendships formed, under conditions of the kind of involuntary intimacy that ordinary social life almost never produces. Women who slept within feet of one another for months or years, who witnessed each other through the worst nights, who learned each other's habits and fears and small private preferences, sometimes formed attachments of surprising depth and durability. Patient friendships in the Victorian asylum are underrepresented in the historical record because the institution had no particular reason to document them, and patients themselves were rarely in a position to leave written accounts of their social lives inside the walls. But the traces are there if you look, visiting records that show the same names appearing year after a patient has been discharged, suggesting the friendship continued outside. Petitions that patients submitted on behalf of specific fellow patients whose circumstances they found unjust. The testimony of former patients who described specific women they had known inside with clarity and evident affection decades after the fact. The institution was designed to isolate. What it could not fully prevent was connection, which found its way through the regulations as water finds its way through stone, slowly and without announcement, in ways the architects of the system had not planned for and could not entirely stop. The Lunacy Commission, established under the 1845 Act, was responsible for the formal oversight of the entire asylum system in England and Wales. Its inspectors visited institutions throughout the year, examined the buildings and the administrative records, interviewed patients and staff, and produced the detailed reports that were submitted to Parliament, and that form one of the most valuable archives for anyone studying Victorian asylum life. The commission was, like everything in the official structure of the Victorian period, an exclusively male body. Its inspectors were qualified medical men, and its lay commissioners were drawn from the legal and administrative professions. Women had no formal role in the inspection process, and yet women are present throughout the inspection records, filtered through the language and judgments of the male commissioners, but discernible beneath that filtering if you read carefully enough and with sufficient patience. The commission required its inspectors, as part of their formal procedure, to interview patients who wished to speak to them privately. This provision was one of the most important and most inconsistently applied patient protections in the Victorian system. When applied properly, it gave patients who were coherent and motivated enough to request a private interview the opportunity to put their concerns before an outside authority without immediate institutional filtering. A patient could sit across from a lunacy commissioner in a room away from the ward and away from the attendants and speak. Whether that speech was accurately recorded, whether it was taken seriously, whether it resulted in any action, varied enormously. But the provision existed, and some women used it effectively. The inspection reports contained thousands of these patient accounts, recorded in the third person and at whatever length the inspectors considered significant. They contain women describing their admissions, sometimes in terms that match the official narrative of the institution, and sometimes in terms that directly contradict it. They contain complaints about specific staff members, about food, about correspondence that had been withheld or read without permission. They contain requests for contact with lawyers, for access to family members who had not been permitted to visit, for discharge. They contain, occasionally, arguments of considerable sophistication about the legal grounds for continued detention, made by women who had clearly spent the months of their confinement thinking carefully about the law that governed their situation and preparing the most effective possible case for release. The inspectors varied enormously in how seriously they took what they heard. Some recorded patient accounts with evident care and followed up on specific complaints with the institutional authorities in ways that produced documented changes. Others clearly regarded the patient interview as a formality to be discharged rather than a genuine mechanism of accountability. Their reports reflect this in the brevity and dismissiveness of their records of what patients said to them. The commission itself could be pushed, however. When the reform movement generated enough public pressure, when specific cases produced parliamentary questions that required formal and public answers, the commission became visibly more energetic in its oversight functions. Inspectors visited more frequently. Deficiencies were noted more precisely. Recommendations were followed up on more persistently. The relationship between public advocacy and institutional accountability was direct and demonstrable. Visibility created pressure, and pressure produced action, slowly and incompletely but genuinely. This dynamic underlines something important about the role of the women who advocated for reform from outside the asylum walls. Their work was not separate from the official inspection and oversight process. It was the engine that drove that process when it might otherwise have settled into comfortable routine. There is one final dimension of this story that deserves attention before we close, and it is perhaps the one most rarely acknowledged in the histories that deal with this period: the cost to the women who did the caring, not the cost to the patients, which we have discussed at length, and not the cost to the reformers who campaigned from outside, but the cost to the women who were inside the institution every day, doing the daily work of managing and maintaining and quietly humanizing a world that was never designed with their well being in mind either. The matrons, who spent decades inside the Victorian asylum, managing the female wards and the domestic economy of the institution and the complex human politics of hundreds of people living in enforced proximity, gave significant portions of their lives to institutions that rewarded them inadequately and recognized their contribution almost not at all. The best of them brought genuine skill and genuine care to work that was, by any honest assessment, among the most demanding that any woman in the Victorian period could have undertaken. They were responsible for the welfare of deeply vulnerable populations in conditions of chronic underfunding, with minimal formal authority and no professional support structures of any kind. They had no one to talk to about the weight of what they carried. They had no framework within which their expertise was formally recognized and compensated. They had no professional community that understood what they did. They simply did it, year after year, largely in silence, and were thanked with the institutional equivalent of a nod. The attendants who worked the wards year after year, who sat with acutely disturbed patients through the long nights, who managed the physical care of women who could not manage themselves, who absorbed daily the accumulated distress of wards full of people in significant pain, were doing work whose toll was never formally acknowledged and for which no support was ever provided. There was no such thing as psychological support for asylum staff in the Victorian period. No formal debrief after a patient death. No recognition that repeated exposure to human suffering in conditions of institutional isolation might have lasting effects on the people doing the work. The women who left asylum nursing took with them the memories of patients who had become through years of proximity something close to their family, and of patients who had deteriorated and died under their care, and of moments of crisis and moments of quiet connection that the official record had never thought to note. They carried all of this privately because there was no other way to carry it, because no one had thought to provide a better one. And the reformers who spent years pressing for changes to a system that resisted those changes at every turn, who wrote the letters and held the meetings and gave the testimony and absorbed the dismissal and the condescension and the implicit threat to their own social respectability that advocacy on behalf of the institutionalized always carried, they too paid a cost that the histories of their campaigns rarely linger on. Louisa Lowe spent more than 20 years as an active reformer after her release from the asylum. 20 years of meticulous, disciplined work in a cause that was permanently under-resourced and perpetually fighting uphill against the inertia of institutional medicine and the reluctance of government to undertake the fundamental legislative changes that would have addressed the worst abuses. She was formidably determined and formidably competent. She was also, for most of that time, doing this work largely alone, without the organizational infrastructure or the funding or the mainstream social support that would have made it more sustainable. The cost of sustained, isolated advocacy of that kind is not something the historical record easily captures or quantifies, but it was real, and it was borne primarily by the woman herself. What all of these women share across the very different roles they occupied is that they gave something to an institution or to a struggle against one that the institution or the struggle was never quite willing to fully acknowledge or adequately repay. They did it anyway. That is, perhaps, the most accurate and most important thing that can be said about all of them. Not that they triumphed, not that the system they worked within or challenged was completely transformed by their efforts, but that they showed up, that they kept doing the work in conditions that gave them every practical reason to stop, and some days every emotional reason too. That is not heroism in any dramatic sense. It is something quieter and more durable than heroism. It is simply the refusal to stop being present to what is real and to what needs doing. It is the quality that shows up again and again in the history of women working in impossible conditions across every period and every context. And it is worth noticing. It is worth naming specifically rather than letting it dissolve into the abstraction of historical narrative. Even now, at the far end of a long and quiet evening, in the comfortable dark. And so, here we are, gently, at the end of tonight's long, slow journey. I hope the story has been interesting enough to keep you with it for a while, and soft enough to carry you toward sleep when the time was right. Let the images settle now, if you can feel them still moving through your mind. The long stone corridors, the rows of narrow beds, the women bent over laundry tubs in rooms full of steam, the matron moving through the wards at the end of a long day, checking, noting, adjusting the small things within her reach, the attendant in her chair by the dormitory door, watching over a room full of sleeping women, most of whom she knows by name. The reformer at her desk in the lamplight, writing her careful, meticulous letter to a member of parliament who may or may not read it, because the alternative is silence, and silence was never something she was willing to accept. These were real women, complicated women, women who were wronged, and women who did wrong, and women who did their imperfect best inside a system that gave them very little room to do anything else. They are long gone. The institutions that shaped their lives are largely gone too, but something of what they did persists in the law that is stronger than it was, in the profession of psychiatric nursing, which is what it is, partly because of the women who did that work before there was a name for doing it professionally, in the tradition of patient testimony, of refusing to let the institution be the only one that gets to tell the story. Sobering to sit with all of that, and quietly comforting too, in its way. People pushed, things moved, slowly, not enough, but not nothing. Let that be the last thought for tonight, if you still have thoughts. If your mind has already begun to drift, if the words have become sound rather than meaning, if the story has turned into something softer, that is exactly right. That is exactly what this is for. Your body has already found its position. Your breathing has already slowed. The room around you is doing what it always does in the small hours, settling, quieting, becoming the particular kind of still that belongs to the night. There is nothing left to do, no version of yourself that needs to be maintained right now, no decisions that can't wait until morning. Just this, the weight of the blankets, the dark behind your eyelids, the slow and patient approach of sleep. It has been coming for you for a while now. Let it arrive. Thank you for spending this quiet time with drowsy history. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whatever time it is there, I hope the story found you somewhere comfortable and carried you somewhere restful. If you drift off before the end, and I hope you did, the channel will still be here in the morning with more slow histories whenever you need one. Sleep well, rest completely, and I will see you in the next one.